Please.
Okay, so I think we probably should get started to make use of our time. Is that good?
Sounds good.
Okay.
Yeah. Although, to be fair, Jill, I mean, we are on Pitzer time.
Pitzer time.
Should we really?
Would you like to wait a little longer?
Right, right on target? Not sure. Yeah. Huh? No, I'm kidding. Yeah, you could.
Yeah, let's go ahead and start. Okay. So I just want to start by saying welcome to everybody. My name is Jill Hawthorne, class of 87, and a member of the Alumni and Family Engagement Team. We are proud to bring you today's lecture by Professor Andre Wakefield as part of Pitzer at Home. Pitzer at Home was created in response to the stay-at-home mandate, offering a new way for alumni and family to stay engaged with the college through interesting lectures and events. Also, Pitzer at Home enables us to reconnect with friends, classmates, former faculty, former students, all from around the globe at home. Today we have 3 alumni who will introduce Professor Wakefield. Brian Orser, class of 17, Max Dewit, class of 19, and Amanda Chang, class of 16. So at this point, I ask Brian to take it away.
Thank you, Jill. Hi, everybody. I'm Brian and graduated with a bachelor's in philosophy, and I'm now working on a master's degree in architecture at Yale. And to keep things concise, I just wrote things down, so I'll read it for you. Won't be the most dynamic delivery, but as a former student of his, it's an honor to introduce Andre Wakefield, professor of history at Pitzer College. An academic since before I was born, Professor Wakefield has earned a bachelor's in philosophy and mathematics from St. John's College, a master's in public affairs from University of Minnesota, and both a master's and a PhD in history from University of Chicago. I think it's fair to say that this wide range of study demonstrates Professor Wakefield's transdisciplinary interest in thinking, knowing, and acting. As such, his teaching helped me to build a bridge from the abstractions I absorbed as a student of philosophy to the particulars and specifics of the world. Andre is a great guy and also possesses that rare intellect that doesn't revel in its own abilities and doesn't indulge in mental games. His skepticism about ideas, informed by a close study of their history, makes his teaching something like a cold bucket of water in the face. For example, I remember clearly our class discussions about the racial ideologies entangled in the creation of the United States National Park System and the problematic construction of the American wilderness. Andre's approach to ideas has stuck with me, as has his emphasis on historiography. Studying architecture at Yale now, I find myself able to engage critically with the ideas architects use, putting them in perspective not through deconstruction, but through a close study of historical context, textual archives, and microhistorical details. Andre taught me to see how people use ideas to advance their own agendas and how writing and images operate rhetorically or as propaganda. That realization will remain at the foundation of my own work. So thanks for that, Andre. It's good to see you again.
Good to see you. Thanks, Brian.
So I believe I'm next. Nice job, Brian. Tough act to follow there. And I'm kind of in a similar mindset to try and keep it concise. I wrote some stuff down. So I'm Max Dewit, and I graduated Pitzer in 2019. Professor Wakefield was my advisor for all 4 years at Pitzer. And for those of you who had Professor Wakefield as a teacher during my time at Pitzer, you might know me as the guy who took way too long in office hours, but it wasn't my fault. Wakefield and I just had too many things to talk about. Whether it was my freshman year discussing Foucault and his class on prisons, or my senior year discussing the weekend's soccer games for 30 minutes before we even got into what our actual meeting was about. Wakefield challenged me throughout college to do things my way and always made himself available to help me think out my non-stereotypical path at Pitzer. He helped me declare a major that was written out of all the schools the year after I started attending Pitzer, American Studies, Legal Studies. More than anything, Wakefield pushed me to be the best player in the that my coach at Pomona Pitzer and I didn't always get along, and Wakefield became my confidant. He helped me learn how to navigate a tough love style. Ooh, can everyone hear me? Sorry, because my internet.
It was a little glitch, but you're back, Max. You're back.
All right. Thank you. He helped me learn how to navigate a tough love style coach. He helped me laugh at the ridiculousness, but also called me out when I was the one who was out of line. Perhaps the biggest challenge Wakefield asked me to undertake came in the form of a volunteer coaching position he offered me my senior year of college. In addition to his many roles at Pitzer, he was also the assistant coach of a 16-year-old boys soccer team comprised mostly of kids from lower income households. All the boys on this team were collegiate level players, but few had any idea of how to get there. Wakefield and I had often discussed how difficult it was to get recruited to play collegiate soccer, especially when your family doesn't have the time/money to invest in recruiting aids. Now he was asking me to do something about it. His idea was simple. He talked to a local tutoring center whose goal was to help bridge the education gap amongst socioeconomic classes by offering tutoring at much cheaper rates, and got the center to take on the boys on his team. Meanwhile, I got a volunteering job via Wakefield at the tutoring center so I could be a presence for these boys off the field as well. This experience that Wakefield gifted me is the epitome of what he was trying to teach me during my 4 years of Pitzer. He saw a problem without an existing solution and took it upon himself to find one. He did it the Wakefield way. I'll carry this lesson and all the others as I begin my journey in law school this fall. Thanks so much, and here's Amanda to share some experiences with you guys now.
Hi, everyone. I wrote nothing. And Andre taught me that, just like write nothing and you know, keep going like that. But in terms of how Andre has influenced me, basically strong-armed me into the history major. I was an environmental analysis major and a history minor, and then a combined major, and then finally a history major at the end at my time at Pitzer, taking entry-level courses my senior year because it took me that long to decide. And I think there's so many influences that Andre has had in my life. The biggest one was also my senior year, strong-arming me. There's like a pattern here, to go to see Brian Stevenson speak at Pomona College. And that is the reason why I decided, however many years after I've graduated, to apply and go to law school. Andre has written all my recommendations for anything I've ever applied for. He is extremely helpful, but also knows how to keep you in line when you're starting to daydream too far and keep you grounded in reality. And I just appreciated his guidance as a mentor for all my time at Pitzer, and just having each other to complain to, again, as a confidant. And when he was on the faculty, the chair of the faculty committee, I don't know who signed you up for that or who thought that was a good idea.
All my colleagues. Terrible.
I don't know who did that to you, but yeah, I was just thinking about all the memories we had together at Pitzer, and it was truly a pleasure. So glad to be here.
Thanks, y'all. Do I get to start now, Jill? Is that the agenda? Yeah, okay. Well, thank you so much. I'm just super delighted to see students, former and current, and there are too many screens, so I'm sorry. I see Liam over there. I saw Todd ducking in, but hello to you all. And I just wanted to say thank you to the three of you for not only showing up, but saying pretty much only nice things about me, with two exceptions that I can think of. The strong arm, you said that twice, Amanda. That's rough. Yeah. I like to think I was, cajoling, encouraging, and then, Brian's really killing me with, he was an academic since before I was born. Just let me curl up under my desk now, man. You're killing me. So, but I super thank you to all of you, and it's really great to see everyone again. And I realize that this series is called Pitzer at Home. Jill, have there been other ones? Can people dial up? Give you a chance to pitch it. A couple of minutes. Just take.
Yeah, so I'll pitch at the end. So.
All right. So Pitzer at Home. This is we're about propaganda today. In fact, I'll come back to this at the end. But one of my kids was actually clowning me today because he said, well, aren't you doing propaganda for Pitzer? And you're talking about propaganda? That's trouble, Wakefield. So we should always be self-critical, right? So we'll get back to that. But in terms of thinking about Pitzer at home, for those of you who are maybe incoming Pitzer first years or other folks, we should be clear that hopefully this is not exactly like Pitzer at home, because I will be, Jill said lecturing. I hope it's not that bad, but I will be speaking probably at greater length than all of you know that I like to speak, because I usually enjoy putting other people on the hook. But it occurred to me as you were all speaking, and this is really unfair, but I'm going to do it anyway, I think I might just cut this short because I'm going to get bored listening to myself speak. And then I think I'm just going to have the three of you jump in and we'll do a little mini seminar. Look at that. Look at that. Max is so excited. So yeah, I'm going to totally put you guys on the hook right now. So I will start, and then when I get bored, I will just have the four of us jump in and we will just roll with this thing, right? So collect your thoughts. You guys had no idea what you were signing up for, did you? So
oh yeah, no, we knew.
So okay, let me begin though by just, I know all of us in our different places around the country, possibly the world, sitting in our little Zoom boxes at a moment of just to collect where we're at. Pandemic, don't forget that one. Black Lives Matter protests, which are uprooting a lot of the things that we've taken for granted, I think in mostly good ways. And then a looming economic catastrophe, just to take a few. So all of this happening simultaneously. And the most obvious question that might come to someone's mind, because you'll hear all the time in the media, these are unprecedented times, unique times. Nobody's ever lived through anything like this. So this would seem to be the dumbest time to study history, right? And I get it, but I'll have to disagree, right? And so let's think about one of the things that people have noted, which is time, oddly, in this moment of pandemic and constant Zooming, has seemed to lose its purchase. Everybody feels like time's gotten a little mushy. We're not, the usual structures that anchor us are lost. People are losing a sense of time. And I would argue, though, that as time has lost its meaning, history is actually becoming more important. And I think I'll get into what that means. But let me just first gesture at a little pitch for those of you who haven't seen it. Anybody here, I only can see one screen, but hopefully, anybody here been seen Dark, that German weird TV series that is, I think, 2017-18 vintage? I recommend it. Okay, so Dark is super interesting because it is, in fact, about repetition and recursion. So the idea is it's kind of set in 1986 Germany, right around the time of Chernobyl, but it's built around time travel, and the conceit is essentially, time travel can get boring, but this one's interesting because the conceit is that there's constant repetition and recursion, that the same things happen over and over again without us noticing, right? And I think the reason that Dark is hitting a nerve right now, this German miniseries, is that we're all having that eerie sense, I think, of repetition and recursion in our lives right now. Certainly I am, as a historian. And what I mean, of course, is that we tend to think, if we don't think much about it, and a lot of you have heard my spiel in various classes, but I will repeat it for everybody else here, that we tend to think of time as linear, progressive, right? Moving forward. And this goes to the uniqueness and unprecedented side. But in fact, I would argue that at this moment, there are many ways in which we're much closer to the 1960s or the 1930s than we are to the 1990s, precisely because we're in this time of crisis and disruption and everything else. So all of a sudden, all those periods of crisis and disruption, they seem closer to us. And I think the closer you look at them, they seem even closer to us. And so that's some of what I'm hoping to do today, is to go back to the 20s and 30s and the 60s and think about how people were thinking about police states, propaganda, other things at that moment. And I think that can help us shed some light on our present moment. So Marx, as some of you may know, is somebody I like to teach and think about. But he, of course, said that the tradition of all dead generations weighs like a nightmare on the brain of the living. And I think that at this moment is particularly apt, especially when we start to think about Black Lives Matter and some of the other issues that never ever seem to make progress and never ever seem to go away, right? There's a constant sense of frustration that we have to keep repeating the same things, and that there's a sense of progress always going backwards and not being made. So what I would like to do is think about, there are various ways to think about why progress isn't being made. Marx was a huge player in this, right? Marx worried a lot about why couldn't people just see what was in front of their faces, right? He laid out what he saw the roots of oppression and everything else. And he seemed to believe, I mean, Marx was kind of a naive idealist in some ways. He seemed to believe that if you would just show people the truth, that they would react and overthrow their oppressors, release themselves from their chains. He believed by the end of his life that that was no longer true. And this is where we come to issues of propaganda, representation, what's going on? Why is it that we keep repeating the same things, right? So I would like to start by dropping back to 1922 and one Walter Lipman. And here's Public Opinion. This is a book I'm kind of attached to and I'll be talking about. Most people only know about Walter Lipman through the lens of Chomsky, right? Chomsky wrote this very famous essay called The Manufacture of Consent, right? And in it, he took Walter Lippmann to task because he said, as was true, that Walter Lippmann thought that the only way to save democracy was to engineer public opinion. That is, basically, Chomsky said that Lippmann and other people in the 20s had engineered a kind of American propaganda system so that there'd be consent would be engineered and the people would have no choice. This was the idea. And as far as it goes, that's true. The problem I have with Chomsky is that he didn't take Lippmann seriously. And I think Lippmann deserves to be taken seriously. So what Lippmann argued, basically, if you go back to the beginning in 1922, and it's very important that this is on the heels of World War I, right? We're coming out of World War I, it's a formative experience. And as we'll see later, there's a strong argument to be made that the modern systems of propaganda within which we still find ourselves were pretty much forged in World War I and the experiences of that war, right? Walter Lippmann was not only involved in those systems, involved in the war, he kind of saw that come into being. And then his book is all about some of the systems that came into being during World War I. And what he starts with is he starts with the idea that people are limited, right? We're limited beings. And there's a quote, I'm not going to quote much, but I'll throw this one at you. He says, "For the most part, we do not first see and then define. We define first and then see. In the great blooming, buzzing confusion of the outer world, we pick what our culture has already defined for us, and we tend to perceive that which we have picked out in the form stereotyped for us by our culture." So Walter Lippmann was like the first great theorist of stereotypes. In fact, before him, the way we use stereotype didn't even exist. And he found this to be front and center because of our limited capacities as beings, that we could only deal with a little slice of reality, that in fact we had to stereotype the world even to make sense of it. So for him, a stereotype at the beginning wasn't merely some negative little thing that you do when you're treating people or other things badly. For him, stereotyping went to the heart of what we do as people because we are limited in our capacity to deal with what William James called the great blooming, buzzing confusion of reality. We limit the world, we make it simple, and then we access the world through the pictures we create of it. Just to show you all how ready I am for Zoom teaching, I'm going to do something terrible here. Okay, I'm going to try to share this, and you ready for this? Okay, here's what Lipman said, right? He had this idea of a triangle. Oh, stop it, Max. I see you laughing over there. Yeah, okay, are you laughing at my drawing? It's going to get worse. Okay, he said you got the scene. Oh, that's bad. Okay, the scene and the picture and the response, right? So this was, just imagine there, I'm not gonna fix that too much. There's that scene, picture, response, right? And he imagines it kind of going this way, right? You follow my arrows, sad that though they are. And the important thing here is that if this is reality, whatever that is, the scene of the action, he often talks about it as being, you know, the battlefield of World War I, someplace like that. He says, you know, honestly, we have no real access to the scene of what happens. And that extends even to the people who are at the scene, because even the people who are at the scene have only a limited witnessing capability to take in everything that's going on. And so he says virtually everybody, and that includes people who are far away across the ocean, and it includes people who are right there on the battlefield. All that all of them have and end up with is a picture in their heads, as he puts it, some limited stereotype version of what the scene of that reality was, right? That's what you have access to. And then he says, so everybody, when they respond to whatever happens, whether it's the French Revolution, the Civil War, or what just happened to George Floyd, right? Everybody is dealing with a response based on a picture of what happened, a picture and a stereotyped version of reality. And so based on that, he suggests that there is no way for democracy to work. And this is really where Chomsky comes in and got very frustrated, right? Because by the end of the book, Lipman uses that picture of limited humanity, uses that picture of stereotyping the world, uses that triangular notion I just showed you to basically say, you know, Jeffersonian American democracy is an impossibility. He gets to the end, he says, there is no way for a huge country full of people to successfully do what Jefferson and the founders said, which is to come up with spontaneous notions of public opinion, to act on those notions. You know, whether you want to talk Rousseau, Jeffersonian, all those Enlightenment visions, he said, were based on utopian and unreal visions of humanity. They are impossible. And then you end up with a problem, okay? Because in fact, Lipman was a dedicated liberal. He did want, and I mean a classic liberal, right? He was an opponent of authoritarianism. He wanted U.S. democracy to survive, but he suggests that the only way to have U.S. democracy survive, ironically, was to actually engineer opinion for the people. And how do you do that? This is where you get the rise of the expert, right? So for him, in classic progressive 1920s fashion, he suggests that it is the progressive, the rise of expertise. This is the age of engineering and, you know, positivism and the rise of science. He's saying the only way you're going to save democracy is to create a regime of experts that can process reality for the people, right? Now, Chomsky does something that I think is really fucking obvious, and he gets way too much credit for it, which is say, hey, Lipman, that's anti-democratic, that's terrible. Well, no shit, no, of course it is, right? But that's not really the problem, right? The problem is that Lipman has set up a really difficult situation, one that I think we're still trying to find our way out of, right? Which is, if his version is at all true about human psychology and how we deal with reality and how we process these things and the role of stereotypes. And that's debatable, right? I'm no psychologist, you know, I don't know if we have any on the feed, but we could talk. But if it is even remotely correct, we have a lot of trouble for what we take for, you know, basic civics lessons here, because those Enlightenment versions of democracy are no longer going to work. It's not going to happen, right? And so now we're faced with a conundrum. And I don't think it's a conundrum we can necessarily solve just the way Noam Chomsky did, just by saying it's bad, and let's go back to pretending like we can have spontaneous decision making and it's fine, it's a tricky situation. And so let me jump ahead. Enter, some of you know, Jacques Ellul, my favorite French propaganda theorist. I have to say in passing, for those of you who haven't suffered through my classes, that when I do teach propaganda, you know, one of the perverse things I do is I make, especially when I do this to first year students, which, you know, if any of you are on here and are intending to be in that propaganda class or sign up for it, beware that you will be force-fed this nasty French theorist before we get to do anything, because I feel like we have to get our feet on the ground. But I think Jacques Ellul, writing in 1965, is super important and super interesting. And so we jump here 30, 40 plus years ahead, and now we're in the roiling moment of the mid-60s where stuff is really starting to come apart. He's writing in the same milieu in France that some of you are familiar with, Michel Foucault. He's thinking about the struggles that Frantz Fanon has already laid out in 1961. I mean, this is the moment of roiling, buzzing, uprising and confusion. And he wades into this and writes this book about propaganda. So the reason Ellul is super interesting for me, and the reason I take it as a foundational text for what I teach, is that he gives propaganda a history, right? He finally steps out and says, you know what? Modern propaganda, the kind of propaganda I'm going to talk about, only emerges pretty much in the 20th century, and really in its full form only after World War I, which is why we go back to Walter Lipman, right? Who also had his formative experiences in World War I. And what Ellul says is that for modern propaganda to succeed, it's got to be total. It's got to be everywhere. And only through modern forms of media do you have the kind of technological sophistication, also the density, to make people constantly be surrounded by mechanisms of propaganda. So he makes this a technological claim. So he says by forms of media, by forms of propaganda, the rise of radio, by all these other things, people are allowed to be constantly surrounded by media and forms of propagandization, and that only then do you get the possibility of modern propaganda systems. This should concern all of us, because if he's correct, of course, what you have had ever since 1917 is a constant acceleration of the possibility of constant, I would say, encirclement, as he says, by propaganda systems. Eventually you never get away from it. Now, Ellul does some very interesting things, right? He starts to break down propaganda, and he starts to talk about its ubiquity. And I think most importantly, he makes it more central and more important and less dismissible than people in the past have. And I get this a lot, either in first year classes, talking to people on airplanes or whatever. They're like, oh yeah, propaganda, you think about some East German poster. Usually propaganda has become like a tourist thing. Like we were in Vietnam, you can get old, like North Vietnamese coasters with like, it's funny, like you get to laugh at propaganda, stuff like that. And the idea always being that we can distance ourselves from it, and that only stupid people are subject to propaganda, right? It's not us, it's them. Now, I think Ellul is really good because he brings home very, very directly the idea that we are all enmeshed in propaganda systems. We don't escape. And that, in fact, it's, by the time you get to the end of the book, it's quite, for my money, it's a much darker book than 1984 or anything, because he really shows you the way we're all entrapped in these systems. And it makes it very difficult to figure out how, if at all, you find your way out again, right? And we don't get to just say, oh, hey, it's about critical thinking, we'll figure our way. No. It's not that easy, right? You have to take fully on board all the systems that you're enmeshed in. Okay, one of the things he does, he talks about agitprop and what he dubs integration propaganda. Agitprop is the thing we're all familiar with. Agitprop is the Marxist poster, or the Maoist poster, or the McCarthyite, declaration. Those things that make people, the most familiar form of agitprop probably for a lot of people to this day is Joseph Goebbels and, you know, Nazi propaganda that was literally trying to agitate and have people rise up, which in fact they did in Kristallnacht and a few other places, right? But this is the kind of the propaganda that we're familiar with. And yet Ellul claims in his book that it is the less important kind. And he introduces something else that I think is really innovative and quite good, which he calls either at different points, he calls it pre-propaganda, sociological propaganda, integrationist propaganda, all these various forms. But the point being that the more important forms of propaganda for us are the ones that instill normalcy, that maintain the world as it is. The kind of, you know, and once you start to think about integration propaganda, once you start to think about the things that reinforce the status quo, that keep things in place, that he's saying most of the effort in modern democracies, authoritarian regimes, whatever have you, he doesn't really care about political systems. He's saying in all these places, in all these different forms, integrationist propaganda is the propaganda that keeps things the way it is. But not only that, pre-propaganda, he says, is also a propaganda of preparation. And it takes much more work and much more constant effort than agitprop, which is much more just like lighting a match or flicking a switch, right? So the idea he starts to lay out is that everyday forms of propaganda, right, are much more important, much more ubiquitous, and much more invisible than agitprop, which is what we see, because as he says, it's the flashy kind. It's the kind that everybody notices. So the thing to think about then is, writing in 1965, what Ellul lays out is, he says there are three great propaganda systems. There's the propaganda system of the United States, there's the propaganda system of the USSR, and there's the propaganda system of China. These three great blocks of propaganda. And one of the nice things to think about Ellul analytically, and the reason I like to teach it, is that he completely avoids connecting propaganda systems directly with political systems, which we also tend to do, somewhat unconsciously or otherwise, but we're usually connecting forms of propaganda, especially with totalitarian regimes and other regimes. What he says is, he connects the propaganda system of the Soviet Union with Pavlovian notions of reflex response. He says that also extends to China, right? There's a certain psychological approach where in China and the USSR, they preferred Pavlovian notions where you would simply have a stimulus response. So eventually people would be trained, just like Pavlov's dog, remember, who drooled when the bell was rung because, you know, Pavlov, the dog, knowing he was going to get his food, said that's the same image, you know, that we need to have in thinking about certain forms of propaganda, where when you ring the bell, certain things happen and there's a Pavlovian stimulus response. The key thing for him being that in that case, that, as he put it, intellectual criticism, other things, thought is short-circuited in these systems. And he says the most important thing about systems of propaganda is it needs to short-circuit thought. And this is where he brings up the notion that some of you have, actually, I know some of you in our Zoom room here have spoken with me about at length, but it's an interesting distinction between orthodoxy, which is what we're very familiar with, right? And something he calls orthopraxy. And in notions of orthodoxy, the idea would be, and it's a very common sense notion, right? The idea is that propaganda is, whether it's integration prop or agitprop, propaganda is there to change your opinion, right? It's there to change your mind, to change your opinion, to do something, you know, for instance, an orthodoxy is the standard opinion. So the idea that either reinforcing or overthrowing orthodoxy might be the aim of propaganda. What's interesting about Ellul, and I think he's right, is he says that's completely wrong. He said, you know, honestly, propagandists and other people, they don't really care anymore what you believe. He said that's old Marxist stuff. Marx was into changing people's opinion. Marx was into convincing people. Marx was into, you know, establishing and overthrowing orthodoxy. He said, but by the time you get to the 20th century, that's no longer, that's not the goal at all. What the goal is orthopraxy, which is the goal is to change action, and often to change action by simply short-circuiting thought. And I think Ellul points out at various points, he says in the 20th century, you'll notice, you know, it's kind of a version of what Frederick the Great said years ago, but in new fashion, which is, I don't care what you say, I don't care what you believe, you just better do it. You just better go out and march, or you go out and go join the army, but it's all about praxis, it's about doing things. And so for Ellul, what propaganda is at bottom is the idea that you bypass or you short circuit thought altogether. And it may be masquerading as thought, it may be masquerading as debate, it may be masquerading as a number of things, but what it really is an effort to short circuit thought and move directly to action. And then what he claims, which I think is also quite plausible, is the idea that once people have acted on behalf of a certain ideology or something else, then the process of rationalization kicks in, right? Then you want to justify what it is you've done. And that's actually the role of thought and belief and everything else, is to justify actions already accomplished. So the key is to get people to do things and then rationalize what they've done. And that's how you get what he calls monolithic individuals, individuals who have been psychologically crystallized, individuals who are no longer permeable or open to anything. And I think we've gotten beautiful examples well before our current crisis on both MSNBC and Fox News about how personalities can be crystallized by creating total narratives on 24-hour news, right? And he saw this long before in '65, before we ever got to see it in front of our faces. So I guess I would like to, before I open it up to our 4-person seminar, which I do intend to do, people, yeah.
Hold on.
Amanda, Brian, I haven't forgotten. I'm coming back to that. Yeah.
Go a little bit more into crystallizing personalities.
Oh, you're just trying to run out the clock here, Dewit. I know. I've seen you before. Yeah. Okay. Psychological. You know you're not going to get away with this. So like we'll hit 3 o'clock and it's like, oh, Max, look, we're out of time. So no, we're gonna. Okay. Psychological crystallization is a very interesting term, right? Because when you think about what happens, and, Ellul was very interested in chemistry, among other things. He's got all these weird chemical terms to describe personality transformations. But crystallization is interesting because, of course, what happens when something crystallizes, it becomes rigid, it becomes stuck, it becomes completely monolithic, as he says, and you can't break it anymore. Right? Crystals are famously for their hardness and otherwise, so that the whole image of psychological crystallization is pretty chilling, right? Because the idea, and again, Max, you're taking me sideways here. Yeah. Sly bastard. All right, so here we go. Let's talk about Germany, because of course where Lipman had gotten all his messages and his lessons out of World War I, Jacques Ellul, who fought, and he really did fight with the resistance. He wasn't one of these make-believe French resistance people. He really did. And so his experiences fighting the Nazis and the French resistance and thinking of Joseph Goebbels, these are really the experiences of World War II, especially Germany, are the ones that inform his visions of how propaganda works. And one of the things that was interesting to people was in the POW camps and even in the post-war period, there were Nazi soldiers, especially true believers, who were seen to be kind of like crystallized. It was impossible for the Allies and other people to kind of break them down. They seemed to have these kind of monolithic personalities that he describes, where they had completely enveloped the ideology of the Nazi regime to the point where they were really monolithic individuals who couldn't be broken down because they had developed a worldview that seemed so complete and so impermeable that they were resistant to being convinced otherwise, right? And so he uses these individuals, I think, as a kind of model to talk about what can happen under the pressure of intense propaganda systems. And I think we've all had chilling examples of that in our time, right? There reaches a point at which people are simply unconvincible, right? There's been a lot of talk about science and evidence and openness to debate and everything, but I think it's fair to say there's probably people on right and left at the present moment who can be seen as crystallized monolithic individuals. even though there's been some very interesting studies lately about left and right and who's more open to evidence and things like this, something we could discuss, right? But does that help with the psychological crystallization, Max? It's kind of, yeah?
Yeah, Andre.
Did you freak, Max, or yeah? You were giving me that blank stare, but I believe it was just a frozen screen, so I think we're good.
Yeah, my internet's a little wonky, but
Yeah.
no,
Andre,
so
go
it
ahead.
does, and I guess I was hoping that he would have said something that you might, that helps, deform the crystallization a little bit, or at least ways to navigate, within the crystal themselves.
No, I mean, I think once, the idea being, once you have crystallized personalities, you're already in a bad situation. So
Yeah.
I think if you're trying to go all optimistic and solution oriented here, Max Dewit, I mean, the thing obviously to say would be, don't let the crystals form in the first place,
Right.
along the notion of public health. Let's not get, let's let it not get that far would be the obvious answer. But that's not specifically helpful with what we have going on now.
Totally. And it seems that if you're encircled, to use his word, by propaganda regimes that are also kind of out of touch with the day-to-day person's experience, then is there really, I don't mean to get too deep in there, but is there really a way to stop the crystals from forming in the first place? And especially in a moment, because what I'm thinking about is the current moment, specifically with Black Lives Matter.
Mm-hmm.
And with like COVID stuff, like, is there a way to really, try and not allow crystals to form? And in what way does that kind of shape?
Well, I mean, one of the things that I think is useful about Ellul, but it's actually true of Frantz Fanon, who I brought up before. I mean, Fanon was also writing, about the same time, a little earlier, right? He writes, I believe, 61 is when he writes his famous book, right? And basically what Fanon argues as well, I forget whether it's in 52 or 61, maybe both, but he argues along the same lines that the legacy of colonial violence and racism is so like baked into the system that it's total, that you don't just, and I guess that's why things seem so challenging at the moment. You don't just get to cherry pick, right? I mean, that was Fanon's point too. You don't just get to cherry pick and, send the colonial troops home and, then start up your country from scratch as if nothing happened. The problem is that the issues he talks about class and race and colonial violence, like they're baked right into the very systems that you're living in. And this is the problem that I think we're seeing now with all kinds of issues, from Black Lives Matter to the pandemic, which is that these issues being baked in, you don't just get to, pretend as if everyone puts on masks or you defund a few police departments, you've actually done the job. If it's systemic, the problem is you have to go to the deeper structures, and that's a long-term project. And that goes back to the thing that I was saying at the beginning. It's not as if people, and what I worry about most being a historian, I worry about amnesia, right? I worry about the fact that people often, it's easy to forget that there are decades and centuries of work that people have been doing to pull apart the same structures, and it hasn't completely worked for them. So, the issue is this is ongoing work. It's not, we're not starting de novo, right?
Right. And I guess like two really quick things, and then I can hand the mic to my other two partners in crime here. But so one of the big phrases that, I'm hearing from my friends and from what I read, etc., about this current moment is a call for kind of individual self-reckoning, if that makes sense, especially in regards to white people and their families and their own lives and the lives that have, gone on around them. And that seems to me to be a way that, where the what was that propaganda term? I'm not going to find it, but that seems like one way to that you get, in a sense.
Max, just when you were going to just hit the moment of deepest reflection, you glitched out, so you might have to repeat that. We lost the treasure. Yeah.
Right. I don't know where you lost me, but I guess what I was trying to say is this notion of self-reckoning on an individual level.
Yeah.
Specifically with white people in this country who've historically been here as well, is a really, I think, powerful tool in regards to psychological crystallization and what may have happened to you kind of unbeknownst to you, and then what you may have done to others, again, unbeknownst to you, and just kind of coming to terms with that and evaluating what your role is in the society is one way that I can kind of see it.
Yeah, I mean, we should definitely open this up, but I mean, my only hesitation about that is it seems like, on the one hand, to be a very American kind of solution, that if we all individualistically somehow self-reckon, everything's going to be better. But I just don't see, what, and I'm not, I'm just, where I'm going with this, right? Like, yeah. Unless it translates into structural changes, unless people start getting released from prisons, one of the things we're trying to deal with like prison education, which has been a long issue, is how do we get internet into the prisons, which has been an issue forever, and it really restricts what we can do. And at the moment, there's an opportunity to actually have Zoom classrooms in the prisons, maybe, even though there's been so much resistance for that. And it feels like that's a moment where we might actually leverage self-reckoning into something structural that could actually help real people. Right. But it's always, I'm concerned that it doesn't become a process of white navel gazing. Like, there's got to be some structural outcome.
Totally.
Something has got to happen. Right.
It seems like the first step in kind of a lot of people's minds. And I think I totally agree with you, but yeah. I do think that in order, and I guess my opinion is just my opinion, but in order for a systemic type of change to happen, specifically related to how propaganda plays into it, you got to start with your own self and your own reckoning and your own family around you and friends, and see kind of how you sit in it, and really like take that moment back, and then you can step back in and say, okay, now I can, kind of like Malcolm X,
kind of like self and family reckoning as a precondition for.
Yeah, well, and like, this isn't a perfect comparison, but kind of like when Malcolm X basically, part of what he said was like, hey, white people will talk to you 10 years, give us some time, but we gotta figure out us and what our identity is in this country and what we want it to be as a Black community first. And we're not dissing you or saying anything's wrong with you. We're just saying, like, look, let me do my work here first, and then I can start to integrate myself and what I've come to realize within that. But yeah, so I'll mute myself now.
Thanks, Max.
Yeah.
So, not to put anyone on the spot, but to the rest of you, Amanda, Brian, any thoughts?
I know there's some questions in the chat, but just briefly, talking about habit or crystallization reminded me of pitching your class. So, History 12, William James, Habit. Yeah, the psychology. It's a good read. And I think part of what we're talking about crystallization doesn't necessarily have to be a bad thing, because if you crystallize and you form good habits or useful actions, I found the document. So I still have it also.
You found the William James?
Yes, I pulled up William James.
You just completely human scienced me.
I did. History of the Human Sciences. And he says, make our nervous systems our ally, which I think is part of, education, teaching ourselves, catching ourselves early, forming what we consider good habits. And those habits can be not necessarily in terms of opinion, but how do we keep forming opinions and growing? And like, this is not a stagnant thing. I think it develops.
Okay, Amanda, I have to say, for everybody else on here, I have some good news and I have some bad news. William James, in that particular piece, if I'm not mistaken, basically said, your nervous system is all pliable and you can change and form good habits until you're about 22.
Yep.
So the rest of us, forget it, you're done, people, you're crystallized. But if you're under 22, you can still go for it.
Yeah, I do remember that also, because I remember you warning me as a senior, like, this is it. This is it.
Did I do that? That's terrible. Okay. So,
Well, I mean, it was in the class. It was fine. It's all in good fun. But I do think that is a really important thing to think about in terms of how we form habits, and also like how we form education for future generations. Right. Because right now, I think a lot of our education system, specifically history in elementary, middle school, and high school, is all.
No, I mean, Max. Again, it's a huge problem. No one of us is gonna, solve it. Multiple interlinked problems that we're all facing right now. But I mean, Max said at the outset about coaching 16-year-olds. I think when you go and try to deal with younger folks, it feels a little more optimistic. Let's just put it that way. People are still a little more willing to change their minds, right? But yeah. Orser, did you have anything? I don't want to forget the chat either, because Amanda.
I'll just bring something in from the chat. A lot of people are asking about Facebook and social media. I was just saying to my wife yesterday that maybe we should take on abolishing Facebook as a lifelong goal. But I guess I would ask, like, maybe in contrast to Max and Amanda's comments, like, maybe is it just a matter of seizing the means of mass communication and taking back technology? And then I guess the last thing I'd add is just that I wonder, in terms of reinstating like a public life or a shared world, kind of in the way that Bruno Latour's new book, For Better or Worse, states it, that like, it's not about finding more evidence. It's not about sharing more facts or educating the uneducated. It's about refinding trust or a shared reality, which is sort of it's not the same as doing personal work. It's about building bridges or something. So I just want to offer that.
I like what you did there, seizing the means of communication, of course, a nod to seizing the means of production, but it's not a crazy idea. I guess the question always has been, who is seizing it? I mean, in our ideal utopian imaginations, it's the people. But again, what does that mean? Someone's seizing it. But I think you might be right. It's hard to imagine people seizing it who are worse than what we have at present. So, maybe someone should seize the means of communication. But I will just, full disclosure, I'm uniquely unqualified to talk about Facebook, which is bad as a propaganda theorist, but I'm not on it. So I hear it's bad. My mom likes it, but that's all I know. So is seizing the means of communication connected with seizing the means of production, Brian? I mean, how do you separate the one and the other out?
I mean, I think if propaganda functions today to stabilize and continue capitalist exploitation and production, then I think that they're intimately tied. Or in other words, that the same people who have an interest in one have an interest in the other, and they're probably the same families.
I believe, so. Yep. Hey, everybody, like, I forget, like, all these, windows of Zoom people, like, my students are awesome, right? Huh? Like, I wish I could take credit, but yeah, that's how it is. Let me go through as already Amanda and Brian started to, but just to make sure before we kick off that we hit all the chat. What is the U.S. counterpart to Russian, Chinese? Pavlovian response style. Sorry, that's from Anne. And Anne, I should have said that. I believe in Ellul's opinion, the counterpart was the myth, which I think is quite apt, right? So you imagine where you have Pavlovian style in China and the Soviet Union, he was saying at the same time, you have the myth in the US, and of course the myth was connected to the genius of advertising. So honestly, the foundation piece of American propaganda systems for Ellul comes out of Wall Street and advertising, and that is the American genius of propaganda is selling people the myth. And one of the things that is concerning is that when you're thinking about propaganda systems and you're thinking about the hands we've been dealt, I will indulge myself and tell an anecdote, if it's okay with y'all. One of my low moments in COVID was when when everybody, we had the mask disaster, nobody's wearing masks, and why are we such a stupid country? Why can everybody else get it together, but we're fighting over these super stupid things? And I go get pizza for my kids, and I'm walking out of the pizza place, and I won't name you, some of you probably can guess where it's from, but I look down at the pizza box, and it's this kid on a skateboard, and it's like, unbreak the rules. And it's like, what? And then it hit me all at once. Like, of course, like that's been decades and decades of marketing in the US. Thomas Frank and other people are so good at talking about this, about how every like standard issue marketing campaign is all about the rebels and breaking the rules and how you're a cowboy. And, so we've had these identity things baked in for a long time. Like, this is the crazy thing. Like, you can't blame the mask wearing disaster on Trump. Like, thank you, Wall Street. Like, we've had decades of preparation for, not wearing masks, because like, you're not gonna tell me what to do. I'm gonna be an outlier. I'm unique. I'm not wearing that mask. So, there's something much deeper going on there. And that reminds me of Ellul too, because it comes out of advertising. It comes out of these campaigns. It comes out of that identity formation that, and I always joke, like, when you're thinking about propaganda in an American setting, like, you need to look no further than my stupid Subaru out there, right? Like, why do I drive Volvos and Subarus? Because I'm a professor, because I'm a chump for propaganda, of course, because Subarus are all about love. Like, and we're always like, oh, it doesn't affect me, but you don't see me driving a big white pickup truck out there. That's what you see when you go to Norco prison. They're all driving pickup trucks, and all the stupid professors are driving Volvos and Subarus. You think that's because we're critical thinkers? No, we're propaganda sops, all of us. So, mea culpa. All of us culpa. That's just, that's how it is. And so we should just admit to being suckers. That's a start. It's like we could have an Alcoholic Anonymous kind of meeting here and just confess to our propaganda. I walk into Starbucks like the biggest idiot that I am, right? I'm, among other things, I'm a caffeine addict, but why can't I just make it for myself? Max?
I was gonna say, just to hammer home that term, as I understand it, that seems like a form of crystallization.
The Subaru crystallization?
No. What? No. Back a little bit further. Yeah. The as Anne points out, the Madison Avenue advertising, be the rebel, and it's almost a rebel itself is removed from politics. It's what you choose, what type of rebel you want to be, and you choose what you rebel against, and then you're told the rebel is the good thing, and then let me crystallize, if I'm understanding it correctly, kind of this method of rebelling, and then in addition you get fed what you are supposed to rebel to and what you're supposed to be up in arms about and what you're not.
Yeah, gesturing back to what Brian was saying too, again, like, you think about the Cold War, And when I think about the Cold War, I think about Berlin and the Kaufhaus des Westens, right? The Kaufhaus des Westens was a palace of consumerism erected right at the border between East and West Germany. So the East Germans could look up and see this beautiful palace of consumer goods and choice and everything else. And that's still what, you know, that's what freedom is to us to this day, right? It's that Cold War notion of consumer opportunity, consumer goods, choice. That's our notion of freedom, is that choice. And when people have choice taken away, that threatens identity too, right? If that's what your notion is, you're going to get pretty angry about the lack of choice, which explains, I think, partly our inability to deal with shutdowns or anything like that, right? Are other people, I haven't been very good at monitoring the chat. I want to make, Liam, okay, disappointed in me? Was that the Subaru or the Starbucks? Or there's so many things to be disappointed about, honestly, yeah.
The fact that you don't have a Facebook.
Oh, yeah, no,
Talking about propaganda.
That's bad too. Yeah, sorry, Mom. Mom's probably here somewhere too. Sorry. Yeah. So, I noticed that we're past time, Jill, but are there any last thoughts, shout outs, considerations? See, there's so much pressure. Everyone's thinking, oh, am I going to have the last word? I'll say something else if you say something, so you don't have to have the last word. But
all right, I have a question.
Yeah.
Which is, a lot of the time you were talking, I kept thinking of Freud's Allegory of the Cave. And I guess I'm curious what you think that does to this, you know, does that, you know, sit in with everything that we just talked about in terms of propaganda, you know, and the chaining to the projector over your head, and the only way to detach from that reality is to leave the cave, but of course that's not possible. Or, you know, I guess let me throw that one in there and see what you have to say.
You know, I believe it's funny that you mentioned that. I was trying to remember. It might be Edward Bernays or somebody else. One of these propagandists literally starts their book with the Allegory of the Cave, because that is kind of, you know, it's an overriding image of propaganda. I mean, the fun thing I think about propaganda is not what we've been talking about, which is self-loathing around psychological crystallization. You could go there too. But the fun thing is you can also go metaphysical about propaganda, right? This goes right down to epistemology. It's why I think Lipman and other people are so interesting, is that you don't regard it as a surface phenomenon, but you think about it at so sociological and psychological levels that, I mean, I think the cave is completely apt for that. And with that, I just thank everybody for being here. I'd really like to thank my previous, I don't want to say old students, although some of you are getting up there. Hey, Shivani, good to see you too. Hey, so it was great to be with y'all. And hopefully this whole Zoom thing, hey, you know, I don't want to be negative or anything, but this Zoom thing has got to end too, right? I just miss when I can just be in a classroom with people again, and, you know, or even like sit outside and the stupid planes from Cable Airport can buzz us, but that would be preferable to Zoom. But for the moment, this is what we got, and we'll make the best of it. And it's been a delight seeing you all. Okay? Thanks.
Thank you.
Thanks,
Thank you,
Andre.
Andre.
Yep. Appreciate it.
And thanks to everybody for coming. Thanks to the alumni, and thank you very much, Professor Wakefield, for the fantastic and thought-provoking lecture. It was awesome. A great time to spend.
Okay. Thanks so much. All right. Thanks, Jill. Bye, everybody. Be in touch. All right?
Good to see you, Andre.
Good to see you.
Good
Thanks.
to see you.
Thanks, Jill.
You're welcome.
Thanks, Jill. Bye-bye.
Thank you, Joe.
You're welcome, you all. I loved it.
That's 2.